What if the person sitting next to you in a fast food restaurant was actually the CEO of the entire company? A woman walks into a burger joint just like any other customer. But what she sees, employees overworked, underpaid, and trapped in a broken system, and the worst part, the manager running the place is the kind of boss who thrives on fear. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The plane landed smoothly at O'Hare International Airport, the gentle hum of the engines fading as the aircraft taxied to a stop. Eleanor Ellie Carter stretched her fingers before closing the document she had been reviewing on her tablet. It had been a long flight from London, the final leg of a grueling 2-week business trip filled with endless meetings and corporate negotiations. The car ride back to her apartment in downtown Chicago was quiet, the city lights flickering past the tinted windows. The familiar skyline felt welcoming yet distant. She had spent years climbing to the top, yet moments of solitude like this reminded her of how much she had sacrificed along the way. No family waiting for her at home, no warm meal prepared after a long journey, just silence, a reminder of the choices she had made. Stepping into her apartment, Ellie set her bag down and loosened her shoes. The space was pristine, almost untouched. She had worked hard for this. A luxurious home with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. But it often felt more like a temporary resting spot than an actual home. She poured herself a glass of water, her gaze drifting toward the pile of documents waiting on her desk. She had barely been back for an hour, yet her mind was already shifting gears. A major corporate conference was scheduled in 2 days, where she would be expected to outline the company's vision for the upcoming year. Her team had prepared reports, PowerPoint slides, revenue projections. Everything was in order. And yet, something gnawed at her. Among the stack of neatly organized files was a report she had been avoiding, a confidential internal audit, flagging concerns about labor conditions at certain franchise locations. Ellie sat down, opening the report. The findings were troubling. Underpaid employees, unpaid overtime, managers allegedly pressuring staff to work beyond legal hours. Her fingers tightened around the pages. This wasn't supposed to happen. Royal Burger prided itself on being a company that valued its workers, or at least that was the image they projected. If what was in this report was true, it meant something had slipped through the cracks. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 locations. There were multiple complaints across different regions. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. Was this an exaggeration, a few isolated incidents? Or was this something bigger, a systemic issue lurking beneath the surface? Ellie had always prided herself on staying connected to the realities of her business. Unlike other executives who managed from a distance, she made it a point to visit stores, to understand the day-to-day experiences of employees on the ground. And now it seemed like it was time to do just that. Her eyes settled on one particular store listed in the report, a Burger Royale location in Chicago, Illinois. Complaints about wage theft, overworked employees, and a manager with a reputation for cutting corners to boost profits. She closed the file. Tomorrow, she wouldn't be Eleanor Carter, CEO of Royal Burger Corporation. Tomorrow, she would be just another customer walking into that restaurant. Ellie pushed open the glass door of Burger Royale, greeted by the artificial brightness of fluorescent lights and the faint lingering scent of grease. The dinner rush had subsided, leaving behind a few customers scattered across red plastic chairs and white laminate tables. The hum of the soda machine and the occasional beeping from the kitchen filled the space, blending into the rhythmic clatter of fryers and grills. She took a seat at a booth near the front counter, her posture casual, but her attention sharp. From this vantage point, she could observe everything: the pace of the workers, the efficiency of service, the demeanor of the employees. At first glance, it looked like any other fast food joint, but something felt off. The workers behind the counter moved quickly, yet there was no energy in their steps. Their faces were tight with exhaustion, eyes darting nervously toward the back office every few minutes. The atmosphere was stiff, drained of the usual chatter and light-hearted exchanges found in well-run stores. Ellie's gaze shifted to a young woman in a red uniform, standing near the drive-through station. The name tag read Naomi Brooks. She was speaking quietly to the employee next to her, A man wearing the same uniform, his name tag reading Kevin Martinez. I had to skip lunch today, Naomi muttered under her breath, keeping her voice low. I couldn't even afford the employee discount meal. My check came in lower than last time. Again. Kevin glanced around before responding. You got to be careful talking about that here. If Dawson hears you complaining, he'll cut your shifts. Ellie felt a familiar tightening in her chest. So it was true. Before she could dwell on it, the sharp bark of a voice cut through the air. Move faster! I don't pay you to stand around. Ellie turned her head slightly, her eyes landing on Richard Rick Dawson, the store manager. A man in his mid-40s with slick-back dark brown hair, a crisp black uniform, and an expression of permanent irritation. He stood with his arms crossed near the back of the counter, eyes narrowed as he watched the employees scramble. Naomi flinched at his voice and immediately refocused on her station. Kevin muttered something under his breath before turning back to the register. Ellie observed, taking in every detail. Dawson wasn't just strict, he was ruling with intimidation. She glanced back toward Naomi, just in time to see her pulling her phone out of her pocket. The young woman's face tensed as she scrolled through something, then let out a barely audible sigh. Ellie caught a glimpse of the screen, an employee pay stub, too low for the hours she had clearly been working. Ellie's fingers curled slightly on the table. This wasn't just a single employee feeling underpaid. This was deliberate. Dawson's voice rang out again, louder this time. Put that phone away, Brooks. You can look at your paycheck on your own time, if you still have a job by then. Naomi stiffened, her hands moving quickly to shove the phone back into her pocket. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. The rest of the employees didn't even glance in her direction, too afraid to draw attention to themselves. Ellie watched as Dawson continued his tirade. You think this is a social club? You work until your shift is over, not when you feel like taking a break, he snapped, directing his glare toward Kevin now. And Martinez, if you think I don't notice you slacking off, think again. I can have someone else take your shifts. Ellie had seen her fair share of bad managers, but there was something particularly callous about Dawson. It wasn't just tough leadership. He enjoyed holding power over his employees. And then he went further. You want to work here? You follow my rules. No overtime pay, no extended breaks, and no free meals. If you don't like it, quit. Ellie felt her stomach tighten. No overtime pay? That was illegal. She saw the way Naomi and Kevin exchanged glances, how their shoulders tensed, but neither of them dared to speak up. They needed this job, even if it meant being treated like this. Her mind worked quickly, processing everything she had witnessed. Dawson was manipulating the system, keeping employees underpaid and overworked, all while making sure they were too afraid to complain. Ellie had come here expecting to find some minor infractions, but this was something deeper. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. This wasn't going to end here. She had spent years building this company, believing in its values. If this store was any indication of what had been happening under her leadership, then she had a much bigger problem to solve. As she stood up, she cast one last glance toward the counter, her eyes locking onto Dawson. He didn't notice her, too preoccupied with asserting his control over the young workers. But soon he would. The night air in Chicago was crisp as Ellie stepped out of Burger Royale, the fluorescent lights of the restaurant casting a dull glow onto the sidewalk. She walked a few paces down the street before pulling her coat tighter around her. What she had just witnessed was worse than she had anticipated. This wasn't just a bad manager cutting corners. This was exploitation. Her thoughts churned as she pulled out her phone. With a swipe, she found the contact she needed. The call barely rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Mark Reynolds speaking, her assistant said, his tone sharp even at this late hour. Mark, I need you to pull the payroll records for the Burger Royale on Ashland Avenue. I want full reports on wages, scheduled hours, and actual worked hours for the past 6 months, Ellie said, her voice firm but measured. There was a brief pause before Mark replied, That's specific. What's going on? Ellie exhaled, glancing back toward the restaurant. Something's off. The employees are exhausted, underpaid, and terrified of their manager. I don't think this is just poor leadership. I think it's deliberate. Mark didn't hesitate. I'll get on it first thing in the morning. Do you want me to check other locations? Not yet, she said, already making her next move. But send me any internal complaints from employees at this store. I want to know if corporate has been ignoring them. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, the weight of her findings settling on her shoulders. This was her company. If this had been happening right under her nose, had she been too distant? Had corporate turned a blind eye, or worse, had they covered it up? Back at her apartment, Ellie sat at her desk, her laptop open. She drafted an anonymous email to the company's employee hotline, pretending to be a low-level worker submitting a complaint. I have been working at this location for over a year. We are forced to work extra hours without pay, and if we speak up, we get our hours cut. The manager tells us corporate won't care. I just want to know if anyone is listening. She hit send. If her suspicions were correct, she wouldn't get a response. Or worse, someone in the system was filtering out these complaints before they reached the higher-ups. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the skyline outside. The city stretched before her, vibrant and alive. But somewhere within it, inside the walls of a restaurant with her company's name plastered on it, people were struggling just to get by. She wasn't going to let that slide. The next afternoon, Ellie returned to Burger Royale, dressed in a simple wool sweater and jeans instead of her usual tailored business attire. She had deliberately chosen the lunch rush, a time when employees would be overwhelmed, making it easier for her to blend in. The line stretched to the door, customers shuffling forward with impatient expressions. Ellie took her place in the queue, watching as the workers scrambled behind the counter. Naomi Brooks moved swiftly between stations, taking orders, grabbing fries, and calling out completed meals. The strain was evident in her posture, shoulders hunched, movements rushed, her face void of any real emotion. It was clear that she was running on fumes. Ellie made sure to lag in line just enough to force an interaction when Naomi had a brief moment to breathe. As she finally reached the front, she caught the young woman's eye and smiled, her tone light. "Busy day, huh?" Naomi barely glanced at her, too accustomed to routine small talk from customers. "Yeah, lunch rush is always crazy," she muttered, wiping her forehead before punching in another order. Ellie leaned in slightly, keeping her voice just above a whisper. "Do they give you breaks during all this?" Naomi hesitated, her hand pausing over the register. It was just for a fraction of a second, but Ellie noticed. Yeah, sort of," Naomi said quickly. "I mean, technically we do, but if we're short-staffed, we don't really get them." Ellie nodded slowly. "And over time?" Naomi's eyes flickered toward the manager's office before she shook her head. "We don't get paid extra for staying late. If we ask about it, Dawson just changes our schedule to make it look like we didn't work the extra hours." Ellie felt her jaw tighten, so it was exactly what she suspected. Naomi glanced around again before lowering her voice. "Look, I don't want to get in trouble, okay? I need this job." Ellie softened her tone. "I understand. I know what it's like to feel stuck in a bad situation. It's not fair." Naomi exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I need the money to cover rent, but sometimes I feel like I'm never going to get out of this cycle." Ellie felt the weight of those words. It was one thing to see the numbers on a report, but hearing it directly from someone who lived it made it personal. A sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Brooks, get back to work!" Naomi flinched and immediately turned away. Dawson was watching. Ellie knew she couldn't push further. Not yet. But this was no longer just an internal investigation. It was a fight. As she left the restaurant, she didn't bother looking back. She didn't need to. She already knew she was coming back. Ellie sat at her desk, fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood surface as she stared at the report Mark Reynolds had just emailed her. The numbers were worse than she had anticipated. She adjusted her reading glasses and leaned forward, scanning the key findings. The Burger Royale on Ashland Avenue wasn't just another poorly managed franchise. It was a financial black hole where employees were systematically underpaid and their hours manipulated to keep costs low. Mark's report laid it out in brutal detail. Payroll irregularities. Employees reported fewer hours than they had actually worked. Excessive labor cuts. The store had a much higher percentage of reduced wages compared to other locations. Unprocessed complaints. Several employees had reported mistreatment, but none of the cases had been escalated to corporate. And the biggest red flag of all, Rick Dawson had been flagged in internal audits before, but nothing had been done. Ellie inhaled sharply. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional. She picked up her phone and dialed Mark. "I'm looking at the report," she said without preamble. "This isn't just bad management. This is fraud." Mark sighed. "Yeah, the numbers don't lie. Dawson's been doctoring the payroll system, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's pocketing the difference." Ellie closed the document, rubbing her temples. "And the complaints? Why weren't they escalated?" Mark hesitated before answering. "That's the thing. They were, at least at first. Someone in the regional office marked them as resolved without any follow-up." Her jaw tightened. How deep did this go? "I need more than this," she said. "Find out who signed off on those dismissals. If someone in corporate covered this up, I want to know." Mark's tone turned grim. "Understood. I'll dig further." She hung up, already making her next move. Ellie wasn't the type to rely on secondhand information alone. If Dawson was bold enough to alter payroll records, he was likely hiding more. And she was going to find out exactly what. The third time she entered Burger Royale, she did so with a plan. Dressed in a nondescript sweater and jeans, she moved with purpose, weaving through the late afternoon crowd. This time she wasn't here to observe. She was here to listen. She positioned herself near the hallway leading to the manager's office, pretending to check her phone as employees bustled around her. If Dawson was cutting corners on wages, there was a chance he was doing the same with financial records. And then she heard it, a voice sharp and hushed, drifting from behind the cracked office door. "Don't worry, I already adjusted the reports before sending them up. No one's going to check unless we give them a reason." Ellie's pulse quickened. That was Dawson. She took a casual step closer, pretending to glance at the menu board. The conversation inside continued. "As long as I keep profits high, corporate won't ask questions. They don't care how I do it." Ellie silently pressed the record button on her phone. The arrogance in Dawson's voice was almost impressive. He wasn't just bending the rules, he was betting that no one would ever look twice. She listened as he detailed how he adjusted time cards, making sure no employee ever reached the threshold for overtime. How he marked breaks on schedules that never actually happened. How he deliberately underpaid staff, knowing most of them couldn't afford to fight back. Her grip on her phone tightened. She had all the proof she needed. A chair scraped inside the office. Someone was about to come out. Ellie turned swiftly, walking toward the exit before Dawson could spot her. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from sheer determination. Standing outside, she looked back at the restaurant, taking in the scene through new eyes. How many other locations were operating like this? If Dawson had been getting away with it, then it was possible, no, likely, that other store managers were pulling the same scheme. This wasn't just about one bad manager. This was about a system that had been neglected long enough for corruption to fester. Ellie exhaled, staring down at her phone. The recording was clear, unmistakable. She wasn't just going to take Dawson down, she was going to clean house. Ellie stepped into Burger Royale with a different kind of purpose this time. She wasn't here to observe. She wasn't here to listen from the sidelines. She was here to confront the problem head-on. The restaurant was caught in the lull between lunch and dinner, the hum of the soda machine and the occasional beeping from the fryers filling the space. A few employees moved lethargically behind the counter, their faces drained, their bodies moving more out of habit than motivation. Ellie didn't bother with the pretense of ordering this time. Instead, she walked straight past the register, straight toward the narrow hallway leading to the manager's office. A young employee hesitated when he saw her approach. Ma'am, you can't..." Ellie turned to him with a polite but firm smile. "I need to speak to Rick Dawson." The employee swallowed hard, glancing toward the back. He clearly didn't want to get involved. Before he could decide whether to intervene, the office door swung open. Rick Dawson stood in the doorway, looking irritated as if someone had just interrupted something important. His expression shifted slightly when he saw her. "You again," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Didn't realize you were such a loyal customer." Ellie didn't respond to the jab. She merely tilted her head slightly. "I'd like to have a word." Rick sighed, stepping aside and motioning for her to enter. Fine, but make it quick. Inside the office was small, cluttered with stacks of papers, a flickering computer screen, and a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The air smelled of stale fast food and cigarette smoke, likely from Rick's habit of taking unauthorized smoke breaks outside the back door. Rick sat down behind his desk, arms crossed. So what's the problem this time? Order was wrong? Fries weren't hot enough? Ellie took her time, settling into the chair across from him. She clasped her hands together, tilting her head as if considering her words carefully. I've been visiting this location for a few days now, she began, her voice measured, and I've noticed some concerning patterns. The way your employees seem exhausted, the complaints I've overheard about missing pay, the fear they have when you walk into the room. Rick snorted, shaking his head. Look, lady, you don't understand how this business works. This isn't some charity. I run a tight ship. If employees can't handle the work, they can leave. No one's forcing them to be here. Ellie raised an eyebrow. You mean the same employees who have their hours cut if they question their pay? The ones who are too afraid to take breaks because they know they'll be punished for it? Rick leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Oh, I see what this is. You one of those do-gooders? Think you can walk in here and tell me how to run my store? He chuckled, shaking his head. Listen, sweetheart, I've been in this business for over 20 years. I know how to keep numbers up, how to make sure the place runs efficiently. You don't like how I do it? Tough. Ellie's expression remained unreadable, but her patience was wearing thin. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it on his desk. Then she hit play. Rick's voice filled the small office. Don't worry, I already adjusted the reports before sending them up. No one's going to check unless we give them a reason. As long as I keep profits high, corporate won't ask questions. They don't care how I do it. The room felt smaller all of a sudden. Rick's confident smirk disappeared in an instant. His shoulders tensed, and for the first time since she had met him, there was genuine uncertainty in his eyes. Ellie let the recording play out, then calmly picked up her phone and slipped it back into her bag. I don't think I need to explain what this means, do I? Rick sat up straighter, his hands pressing against the desk. Now hold on, he said quickly, his voice lower, more controlled. That's out of context. You don't know what you're talking about. Ellie tilted her head. Oh, I think I do. His fingers tapped against the desk, his brain scrambling for a way out. Then in a last-ditch attempt, his expression darkened. You don't know who you're messing with, he said, his voice dripping with forced confidence. I have connections. You think you can just walk in here and threaten me? He let out a humorless chuckle. If I were you, I'd back off before you regret it. Ellie didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply regarded him with the same unshaken calm she had when she first walked in. Then she stood. I appreciate the conversation, Rick, she said, straightening her bag over her shoulder. I think we'll be seeing each other again soon. Rick stared at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Ellie walked toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. She turned slightly, just enough to let him see the faint smile on her lips. Oh, and Rick, she said lightly, next time we talk, I suggest you choose your words more carefully. And with that, she was gone. Rick sat frozen in his chair, watching as the door swung shut. For the first time, the man who thrived on power and control felt something he wasn't used to. He felt fear. Ellie stepped into the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Royal Burger Corporation's headquarters, a stark contrast to the greasy, dimly lit office she had confronted Rick Dawson in the day before. The city skyline stretched before her, but she wasn't in the mood to admire the view. Mark Reynolds was already waiting for her, a tablet in his hand, his usual calm expression replaced with something more serious. Beside him sat two members of the corporate compliance team, both looking mildly uneasy as they shuffled through files and notes. Ellie took her seat at the head of the table. We need to move fast, she said, getting straight to the point. Rick Dawson isn't just a bad manager. He's a liability. I want a full-scale investigation into every financial transaction that's gone through that store in the last year. Mark nodded, already pulling up a file. We've started reviewing payroll records. Dawson has been altering timesheets, but that's just the beginning. We found discrepancies in expense reports, supplier payments, and even food waste records. He's manipulating numbers to make the store appear more profitable than it actually is. One of the compliance officers adjusted her glasses. We also pulled employee complaints that had been marked as resolved. It looks like someone at the regional level dismissed them without proper review. Ellie exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming against the table. So it's not just Dawson. Someone higher up let this slide. Mark set down his tablet. That's what it looks like. Ellie's jaw tightened. Then we go all the way up. She turned to the compliance team. I want every payroll and financial report from every Burger Royale location cross-checked for patterns. If Dawson's doing this, others might be too. And reach out to employees who filed complaints. See if they're willing to speak. The officers nodded, already making notes. Ellie shifted her focus. Mark, I need you to get in touch with 2 employees at that store, Naomi Brooks and Kevin Martinez. See if they're willing to provide testimony. Mark hesitated. You think they'll talk? Ellie gave a small nod. Naomi is desperate for change. Kevin's more cautious, but he knows what's happening is wrong. They just need to know they'll be protected. Mark picked up his phone. I'll set up a meeting. As the team dispersed to begin their assignments, Ellie leaned back in her chair, her mind already several steps ahead. Rick Dawson had played the system for too long. It was time to flip the game. Rick Dawson sat in his office, the blinds half drawn, his knee bouncing anxiously under his desk. He had seen the woman, whoever the hell she was, leave the day before, and something about the way she had looked at him unsettled him. She wasn't just another angry customer. And then this morning, corporate had started asking questions. His phone vibrated, pulling him from his thoughts. The name flashing on the screen made his stomach twist. He answered, his voice low. Yeah? The man on the other end, a mid-level accountant at corporate who owed him favors, sounded nervous. Dawson, we've got a problem. I got a request this morning for a full audit on your store's financials. They're pulling payroll records, expense reports, everything. Rick's fingers tightened around the phone. Who authorized it? Came from Ellie Carter's office. His pulse spiked. The CEO? The accountant hesitated. Look, man, I can try to clean up what I can, but if they dig too deep, fix it, Rick snapped. I don't care how you do it, just make sure those numbers look clean before they get to her. The line went dead, and Rick ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had always been able to work around corporate oversight, shifting numbers, delaying reports. But if the CEO herself was looking into this, for the first time in years, Rick felt a real threat. Ellie was in her office when Mark walked in later that evening, a satisfied look on his face. I spoke to Naomi and Kevin, he said. Naomi's all in. She's willing to tell everything. Kevin's nervous, but he agreed to back up her claims. Ellie closed the folder in front of her. Good. We have employees speaking out, payroll evidence, and financial discrepancies. What's next? Mark smirked. You tell me, boss. Ellie tapped her fingers on the desk, then stood. We take it to the board. The next morning, a confidential report landed on the desk of every member of the Royal Burger Corporation's board of directors. It contained a full breakdown of payroll fraud at the Ashland Avenue location, audio evidence of Rick Dawson admitting to manipulating reports, sworn statements from Naomi Brooks and Kevin Martinez. At the bottom of the report was a single line signed by Ellie Carter herself. This issue extends beyond a single store. Immediate action is required. An emergency board meeting was scheduled. Rick Dawson was about to answer for everything. That evening, Ellie stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, gazing at the city below. She had been in this business long enough to know that power wasn't just about making the big decisions. It was about knowing when to dismantle what was broken. She sipped her coffee, her reflection staring back at her. Tomorrow, Rick Dawson would face the board, and he wouldn't see it coming. The boardroom at Royal Burger Corporation's headquarters was a space built for control. High ceilings, dark mahogany tables, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The kind of room designed to remind people where power resided. Ellie walked in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The room was already filled with members of the board of directors, senior executives, and compliance officers. They murmured among themselves, flipping through thick files and reports that had been delivered to them just hours before. At the far end of the room sat Rick Dawson. He looked composed, too composed. Dressed in a pressed black suit, he leaned back in his chair as if this were just another routine meeting. But Ellie saw the way his fingers tapped against the table, the slight tension in his jaw. He had no idea what was coming. Ellie took her seat without a word. The head of the corporate compliance team, a woman named Judith Palmer, stood up and adjusted her glasses before clearing her throat. We are gathered today to review serious allegations regarding financial misconduct and labor violations at one of our franchise locations. She glanced at Rick. Mr. Dawson, given that you are the manager of the store in question, you are here to provide explanations for the evidence we have uncovered. Rick sat forward, offering a measured smile. Happy to clarify any misunderstandings. Ellie said nothing. She didn't need to. The evidence would speak for itself. Judith continued. We conducted a thorough audit of payroll records, employee complaints, and financial transactions for the Burger Royale on Ashland Avenue. The findings are concerning. A second compliance officer, Nathan Green, opened a folder and began reading aloud. First, payroll irregularities. Employees regularly clocked extra hours that were not reflected in their pay. Overtime pay was systematically removed from time cards. Judith picked up. Second, employee complaints about withheld wages, intimidation tactics, and threats of retaliation were ignored or marked as resolved without proper investigation. Nathan flipped a page. Finally, fraudulent financial reporting. Revenue and labor costs were manipulated to appear more favorable on corporate audits. Ellie glanced at Rick. His smirk was still there, but it was forced now. The tension in his shoulders was visible. I assume you have a response, Mr. Dawson? Judith asked. Rick exhaled sharply and spread his hands. Look, every manager at every location is trying to keep their store running efficiently. I did what was necessary. If that meant adjusting a few schedules to make sure labor costs didn't spiral out of control, then so be it. This is how the business works. If employees don't like it, they're free to go somewhere else. There was a shift in the room. Some board members frowned. Others exchanged quiet glances. Ellie leaned forward, speaking for the first time. So you admit to altering payroll? Rick waved a hand. Adjusting, not altering. Judith didn't look impressed. It's illegal. Rick's smirk returned. Then fire me. But let's not pretend I'm the only one doing this. I guarantee you, half the stores in our system are running the same way. If you want to open this door, be prepared for what you'll find. Ellie folded her hands together, her expression unreadable. That's an interesting defense. Rick shrugged. I'm just saying, don't single me out for doing what everyone else is doing. Judith adjusted her glasses. That's not how this works, Mr. Dawson. Fraud is fraud. Rick was still keeping his composure, but there was an edge to his voice now. Come on, we all know these employees exaggerate. They complain because they don't want to work hard. They expect handouts, and when they don't get them, they whine. A murmur ran through the room. Ellie remained quiet, watching, waiting. She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. I think you'll want to hear this. She pressed play. Rick's voice filled the boardroom. Don't worry, I already adjusted the reports before sending them up. No one's going to check unless we give them a reason. As long as I keep profits high, corporate won't ask questions. They don't care how I do it. Silence. The recording ended, and the weight of it settled over the room like a heavy fog. Rick's confidence shattered. His face paled, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for an escape. He let out a nervous chuckle. That's taken out of context. Ellie tilted her head. Would you like to provide the correct context? Rick's mouth opened, then shut. His hands curled into fists against the table. Judith glanced at Nathan. I don't think we need any more discussion. Nathan nodded. No, we do not. The decision was swift. The board voted unanimously. Rick Dawson was terminated immediately. His name would be reported to the company's legal team for potential criminal charges related to payroll fraud. A security officer entered the room, standing near the exit. Rick sat frozen, his jaw clenched. Then slowly he pushed back his chair and stood. He adjusted his suit jacket, but his hands trembled slightly. He looked at Ellie, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. You think you've won? His voice was low, almost venomous. You have no idea what you've just started. Ellie met his gaze evenly. I know exactly what I've started. Rick exhaled sharply, shaking his head before striding toward the door. The moment he stepped out, it was as if his power evaporated. He wasn't a manager anymore. He wasn't in control. He was just another man who had run out of moves. Ellie sat back, watching the door swing shut behind him. Ellie stepped out of the sleek black sedan, adjusting the sleeves of her blazer as she took in the sight of Burger Royale on Ashland Avenue once more. This time, she wasn't here in disguise. She wasn't just an observer, quietly gathering evidence. She was here as the CEO. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as she made her way toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the familiar scent of fryer oil and grilled patties filled the air. Customers sat at booths munching on burgers and sipping sodas, completely unaware that a shift was about to happen. Not just in this store, but across the entire company. Behind the counter, the employees were moving through their routines, though there was a different energy today. Rick Dawson was gone. The heavy cloud of fear that had lingered for so long was beginning to lift, but uncertainty remained. What came next? Ellie stepped forward. The young cashier, a boy who couldn't be older than 19, glanced up at her and did a double take. His eyes widened as recognition set in. He nudged the person next to him, Kevin Martinez. Kevin turned, eyes narrowing for a split second before realization struck. His mouth fell open. You're... Before he could finish, Naomi Brooks emerged from the back, balancing a tray stacked with fresh food orders. She barely noticed Ellie at first, her focus on maneuvering around her coworkers. But as she set the tray down, she glanced up and froze. The entire room seemed to pause with her. Ellie offered a small, knowing smile. Good afternoon, everyone, she said, her voice calm but commanding. I think it's time we had a talk. The employees stood in a semicircle in the dining area, their faces a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Ellie stood at the center, Mark Reynolds by her side, clipboard in hand. I know the past few weeks have been difficult, Ellie began, scanning the room, ensuring every set of eyes met hers. And I know many of you have felt unheard, undervalued, and overworked. A few heads nodded. Naomi's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes flickering with cautious hope. That changes today. A hush fell over the group. Ellie continued, her tone steady. Effective immediately, we are making the following changes. First, all employees will receive a wage increase to reflect fair compensation for the work you do. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the disbelief tangible. Kevin let out a short breath, as if he hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Second, Ellie pressed on, no more unpaid overtime. Your schedules will be adjusted transparently, and any extra hours worked will be properly compensated. A low gasp came from somewhere in the group. Naomi's fingers twitched against her arms. And finally, Ellie said, this store will receive the upgrades it needs. Better kitchen equipment, safer working conditions, and resources to ensure that your work environment is not just tolerable, but sustainable. Silence. Then, applause. It started with Kevin, clapping hesitantly, as if checking to see if this was real. Then others joined in. Naomi's hands were trembling, and when she finally let them drop to her sides, her face crumpled. Tears filled her eyes. She wiped at them quickly, almost embarrassed. But Ellie caught the moment. For so long, these workers had been conditioned to believe that this was just how things were. That mistreatment was inevitable. That fighting back was pointless. Not anymore. Naomi took a shaky breath and finally spoke. You actually mean it, don't you? Ellie met her gaze. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Naomi swallowed, then glanced around at her coworkers. I don't know what to say. Kevin stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. I do. He looked at Ellie. Thank you. A few more voices echoed the sentiment, and Ellie felt the weight of it. This wasn't just about fixing one store. This was about changing the culture that had allowed people like Rick Dawson to thrive unchecked. She nodded once. Let's get to work. As Ellie stepped back, letting the employees absorb the moment, Mark leaned in slightly and whispered, this is just the beginning. Ellie's lips curled into a small smile as she watched the team, her team, exchanged hopeful glances and whispered excitement. "I know," she murmured. She looked around the restaurant one last time. The same walls, the same counters, the same uniforms. But something had shifted. Hope had returned, and this was just the first step. Ellie sat at the head of the long, polished conference table in Royal Burger Corporation's headquarters, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The air in the room was thick with tension. Around her, senior executives and regional directors sat in stiff postures, flipping through reports with guarded expressions. It had been less than a week since she had implemented the changes at the Burger Royale on Ashland Avenue, and already the ripple effects were being felt across the company. Employees from other locations had started submitting similar complaints. Some managers, afraid of being exposed, had reached out to human resources with sudden requests for policy clarifications. The culture of silence was cracking, and not everyone was happy about it. Across the table, Jonathan Pierce, a longtime executive who oversaw regional operations, leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming impatiently against the wood. "This is reckless," he said, his voice measured but firm. "You've taken one isolated incident and used it to justify sweeping changes that affect every store in our system. Increasing wages, limiting overtime cuts. Have you even considered what this will do to profit margins?" Ellie didn't flinch. "I have, and the numbers are clear. Better treatment of employees leads to higher retention, improved service, and ultimately increased revenue." Jonathan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That's a nice theory, but this business isn't built on goodwill. It's built on efficiency. We operate under a franchise model. If we start enforcing stricter regulations on independent owners, they're going to push back. Some may even pull out." A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Ellie had expected this. She glanced at Mark Reynolds, who sat beside her, ready with supporting data. Without hesitation, he tapped his tablet and cast a report onto the massive screen at the front of the room. "This is an internal study conducted last year," Ellie began. "Stores with higher employee satisfaction saw a 14% increase in productivity and a 9% decrease in operating costs due to lower turnover rates. ND, let's talk customer retention. Locations with lower complaints about service quality saw a revenue boost of up to 7% over 6 months." She let the numbers settle. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged glances. But Jonathan wasn't convinced. He crossed his arms, his tone turning sharper. "Even if that's true, forcing franchise owners to comply with higher wages and stricter labor rules means increased costs up front. Not every location can afford that. Some will fail." Ellie's expression didn't change. "The only stores that will fail are the ones that have been abusing the system for years. The rest will thrive." A silence settled over the room. Then from the other end of the table, Margaret Holloway, a senior board member known for her pragmatic approach, spoke. "I think we need to acknowledge something important," she said, folding her hands neatly. "The Dawson case wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a larger problem. If we ignore it now, we risk much bigger consequences down the line." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had expected full resistance, but now, doubt was creeping into the minds of some of his colleagues. Ellie leaned forward, her tone unwavering. "This company has survived by adapting. We can either lead the industry in ethical labor practices, or we can fight this change until it's forced on us by lawsuits and regulations. I prefer we take control of our future." More murmurs, some nods. The tide was shifting, but Ellie knew Jonathan wouldn't back down that easily. Hours later, after the meeting adjourned, Jonathan walked briskly down the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear. "We have a problem," he muttered, his voice low. On the other end, a familiar voice responded. "I take it the board wasn't as easy to convince as you thought?" Jonathan exhaled sharply. "Some of them are starting to listen to her. If we don't act fast, she's going to change the entire structure of this company." A pause. Then the voice replied, "Then it's time to push back." Jonathan nodded to himself as he stepped into his office and shut the door. Mark Reynolds paced outside Ellie's office, gripping his phone tightly. The message he had just received left no room for doubt. He inhaled deeply before pushing open the door. Ellie sat behind her desk, flipping through a report, her expression unreadable. The skyline of Chicago stretched behind her, but her focus remained on the storm brewing within her own company. Mark didn't waste time. "We have a problem," he said, voice low but urgent. "Jonathan and his people are making their move. They've convinced a group of board members to call for a vote of no confidence. It's happening next week." Ellie didn't flinch. She merely set the document down, folding her hands. "How many votes do they have?" Mark hesitated. "Enough to make this a real fight." Ellie leaned back slightly. "So they're finally showing their hand." Mark stepped closer. "They think you've overstepped, that the wage increases and policy shifts are a financial risk. Jonathan's rallying franchise owners, warning them that if you stay in power, their profits will shrink." Ellie let out a slow breath, her eyes sharp. "Let me guess. He's positioning himself as the logical choice? The one who will restore order?" Mark nodded. "That's exactly what he's doing. And if we don't act now, he might actually succeed." Ellie tapped her fingers against her desk. "Then it's time to remind them what's really at stake." The next morning, Ellie moved swiftly. She knew she had 1 week to turn the tide. She began by reaching out to the undecided members of the board, the ones who weren't fully aligned with either side. In a private meeting, she laid out the facts. "We're at a crossroads," she said, scanning the room. "We can either modernize this company and create a more sustainable future, or we can cling to an outdated system that prioritizes short-term gains over long-term success." She gestured to a financial analysis Mark had prepared. "Employee turnover is one of our biggest hidden costs. The stores with the lowest retention rates are also the ones with the lowest profit margins. Higher wages mean better trained, more motivated employees, which in turn increases customer satisfaction and revenue." Some board members nodded, considering her words. Others remained skeptical. One director, a reserved man named Philip Lancaster, adjusted his glasses. "I understand the logic, Ellie, but changing the structure of a company this large isn't easy. And let's be honest, profitability is still the priority." Ellie met his gaze. "Then let's talk profitability. Since implementing changes at the Ashland Avenue store, their monthly revenue has increased by 12%. Customer retention is up. Complaints have dropped. If we roll this out correctly, the company doesn't lose money. We make more." Philip exchanged glances with another board member. The doubt in the room was shifting, but it wasn't enough. Ellie needed more leverage. That's when she turned to the press. 2 days later, an article hit major business news outlets. "Royal Burger's leadership shakeup, a battle between profit and ethics." The story featured first-hand accounts from Naomi Brooks and Kevin Martinez, detailing how workplace abuse had been allowed to fester under Rick Dawson. It highlighted the systemic problems within the company and how Ellie's reforms had already started turning things around. By the afternoon, social media was buzzing. Customers praised Ellie for taking a stand. Advocacy groups began calling for other companies to follow her lead. The pressure was mounting, and Jonathan Pierce knew it. In response, Jonathan called his own press conference. Standing behind a polished podium, flanked by several franchise owners, he addressed the growing controversy. "We are at a crucial moment in our company's history," he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "And we must ask ourselves, are we making decisions based on sound business principles, or are we letting emotions dictate our future?" A reporter raised a hand. "Are you saying the recent changes are bad for business?" Jonathan gave a rehearsed sigh. "Look, we all want employees to be treated fairly, but running a company means making tough choices. Our focus should be on maintaining profitability, ensuring that Royal Burger continues to grow, not experimenting with policies that could destabilize our franchise model." The message was clear. Ellie was a risk, and it was working. Some investors began expressing concerns, unsure which direction was best. The boardroom was packed on the day of the vote. Ellie entered calmly, her gaze meeting Jonathan's across the long table. The tension was thick. Board members sat in heavy anticipation, ready to decide her fate. Mark leaned in, whispering, "This is it." Ellie nodded. She knew. She took her seat, exhaled slowly, and prepared for the battle that would define her legacy. The boardroom was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the low hum of the city outside. Every seat around the long, polished table was occupied. Executives, senior directors, and major shareholders had all gathered for what would be one of the most consequential meetings in Royal Burger Corporation's history. At one end sat Jonathan Pierce, his expression calm, yet smug. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. To his right sat a few of his closest allies, regional managers and longtime board members who favored maintaining the status quo. They believed in stability, in protecting profits at any cost. Across from them sat Ellie Carter. She didn't fidget. She didn't glance around nervously. She simply observed, her hands resting neatly on the table. She knew what was at stake. Mark Reynolds sat beside her, flipping through the latest reports. "They think they have this in the bag," he murmured. Ellie gave a small nod. "They're about to find out they don't." The chairman of the board, Daniel Whitmore, cleared his throat and stood. "This emergency session has been called to address a motion brought forth by several members of the board," he said. "The matter before us is whether or not Ellie Carter should remain as CEO of this company." A murmur passed through the room. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice smooth but firm. "Before we proceed to a vote, I believe it is only fair that we discuss the reasoning behind this motion." Daniel gestured for him to continue. Jonathan clasped his hands together. "Let's be honest about what's happening here," he began. "Our company has thrived for decades under a proven business model. Our franchisees operate with minimal interference, allowing us to expand rapidly and maintain strong profit margins." He glanced around the table, making sure to lock eyes with key investors. "But in the past few months, under Ellie Carter's leadership, we've seen a shift toward unnecessary risk. Wage increases, stricter labor policies, more oversight." His lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't how we built this company." A few nods, a few murmurs of agreement. Jonathan pressed forward. "Ellie believes she is saving this company. In reality, she is undermining it. She is prioritizing employee satisfaction over shareholder value." He let that statement hang in the air. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not the kind of leadership we need. Silence followed. Then Ellie stood. Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "Jonathan is right about one thing," she said. "This company has been incredibly successful, but let's not pretend it has been without problems." She pressed a button on the small tablet in front of her, and the screen at the front of the room lit up. Graphs, data points, financial projections. "Here are the real numbers," she said, stepping aside so everyone could see. "Since implementing better wage policies and improving working conditions at our pilot stores, we've seen higher productivity, lower turnover, and a steady increase in revenue." She tapped another slide. "Here's what happens if we do nothing." The numbers were stark. High employee dissatisfaction, increasing unionization risks, and a growing negative public perception. Customers care about how we treat our employees. The next generation of workers will not tolerate what we've ignored in the past. If we refuse to adapt, we will be left behind. She let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "The choice is simple," she said. "We modernize or we fall apart." A long silence followed. Jonathan sat up straighter, his jaw tight. He hadn't expected this. Some board members whispered among themselves. Others looked down, reconsidering their stance. Daniel cleared his throat. "I believe we've heard enough. We will now proceed with the vote." The tension in the room thickened. One by one, board members cast their votes. First, Jonathan's supporters. They voted against Ellie. No surprises there. Then, the progressives, the ones who had begun to see the benefits of Ellie's policies. They voted to keep her. The count was neck and neck. Then it came down to Olivia Harper. She was an older woman, a longtime investor who had seen every CEO rise and fall. She was known for being measured, never making decisions lightly, and now her vote would decide everything. The room held its breath. Olivia slowly removed her reading glasses and folded her hands. She looked at Jonathan, then at Ellie. Then she spoke. "We have spent years pushing for short-term gains," she said, her voice steady. "But I believe Ellie is right. It's time to think about the future." Then she cast her vote for Ellie Carter. The results were announced. Ellie had won. The board officially declared Ellie Carter will remain CEO and proceed with her strategic reforms. Jonathan stiffened in his seat. He exhaled sharply, his face tight with controlled anger. He had lost. Slowly, board members rose from their seats, shaking Ellie's hand, acknowledging the outcome. Some still looked hesitant, but the decision had been made. Jonathan pushed back his chair and stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He buttoned his suit jacket, glanced once at Ellie, and walked out without another word. Ellie sat back down, exhaling quietly. Under the table, she clenched her fist. She had won this battle. But she knew Jonathan wasn't finished yet. Jonathan Pierce sat in a dimly lit private lounge at one of Chicago's most exclusive clubs. Across from him, two major shareholders of Royal Burger Corporation swirled their whiskey glasses, listening intently. The air smelled of aged liquor and polished mahogany, the kind of place where real decisions were made, behind closed doors. "We're not finished," Jonathan said, his voice steady, controlled. "Ellie Carter may have won the vote, but she's making moves that will hurt our long-term investments. And we all know how this ends. Shareholders panic, profits drop, and the board will regret ever keeping her." The man across from him, Richard Calloway, leaned forward. "So what's the plan?" Jonathan took a sip of his drink before setting it down carefully. "I'm cashing out, selling my shares to Westgate Capital, a private equity firm that has been looking to expand into the fast food industry. They have the resources to put pressure on Ellie from the outside." Calloway exchanged glances with the other shareholder. "If Westgate takes a controlling interest, they can force major operational changes," Jonathan finished, "including replacing her when the time is right." There was a long pause, then Calloway nodded slowly. "Keep us informed." Jonathan smirked, raising his glass. "Oh, I will." Back at headquarters, Ellie Carter was 3 steps ahead. She knew Jonathan wouldn't go quietly. The man thrived on power, and if he couldn't control the company from within, he would try to undermine it from the outside. That's why she had already set her next move into motion. She sat in the main corporate conference room, surrounded by senior executives, compliance officers, and regional managers. A large digital dashboard displayed company-wide statistics, payroll expenses, employee retention rates, customer satisfaction scores. "We're launching a full audit across all franchise locations," Ellie announced, "effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the room. "Every store will be reviewed for labor violations, wage theft, and operational inefficiencies." She let that settle before continuing. "And any location found engaging in unethical practices will be required to implement changes or risk losing their franchise license." Some regional managers looked uneasy. Others nodded in approval. Ellie's gaze swept across the table. "This isn't about punishing franchises. It's about ensuring accountability. The more we delay this, the bigger the risk we take as a corporation." Mark Reynolds, seated beside her, chimed in. "The reports from the pilot locations have been clear. Stores that implement better employee conditions are already seeing increased efficiency. This is about sustainability, not just ethics." One executive, Gregory Henson, frowned. "There are franchise owners who won't take this well." Ellie nodded. "Then they can sell their stores to those who are willing to run them the right way." Silence. The message was clear. This was happening, whether they liked it or not. At the same time, Ellie knew that real change wasn't just about policies, it was about people. She sat across from Naomi Brooks, who still looked somewhat in disbelief that she had been called up to the executive floor. "I want to offer you a promotion," Ellie said, watching Naomi carefully. "Assistant manager of the Ashland Avenue store." Naomi's eyes widened. "Me? You've proven your leadership," Ellie said simply. "And I want you to be a part of this transformation. Not just for yourself, but for every employee who felt powerless before." Naomi blinked rapidly, clearly overwhelmed. I don't know what to say." Ellie smiled. "Say yes." A few moments passed before Naomi let out a shaky breath and nodded. "Yes." 3 days later, a bombshell article hit the business world. The CEO who's changing fast food. Ellie Carter's bold reforms are disrupting the industry for the better. The article detailed how Royal Burger Corporation was leading a new wave of ethical labor reform, painting Ellie as a visionary leader rather than a reckless risk-taker. It featured interviews with employees like Naomi, who described the impact of these policies firsthand. Stock prices rose slightly as public sentiment shifted in Ellie's favor. Customers began voicing their support on social media. The board took notice, and so did Jonathan Pierce. The final blow came when Jonathan announced his departure from Royal Burger Corporation. His resignation email was short and bitter. As I no longer align with the company's new direction, I will be stepping down and divesting my shares immediately. I am confident that time will reveal the flaws in this leadership approach. But Ellie wasn't celebrating yet because she knew what was coming next. Hours later, Westgate Capital issued a press statement confirming their acquisition of Jonathan's shares. They were now a major stakeholder in the company. Ellie stood by her office window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. Mark walked in, holding a printed copy of the news article. "He didn't just leave," he said grimly. "He's setting up the next attack." Ellie nodded slowly. "I know," she murmured, "but we're ready." Jonathan Pierce sat in the boardroom of Westgate Capital, the sleek offices overlooking downtown Chicago. A glass of untouched bourbon sat on the table in front of him. Across from him, Thomas Greer, the CEO of Westgate, flipped through a folder containing the latest financial reports of Royal Burger Corporation. "We have a window of opportunity," Jonathan said, his voice controlled but firm. "Ellie Carter's reforms are weakening the franchise model. We push the right narrative, and the board will start questioning her leadership again." Greer nodded slowly. "And what's your plan?" Jonathan smirked. "We hit her where it hurts. Public perception." The next morning, a damaging article surfaced in the Chicago Business Journal. "The cost of idealism: is Ellie Carter's leadership hurting Royal Burger?" The article painted a bleak picture, citing anonymous franchise owners who claimed they were struggling to keep up with wage increases and additional labor protections. It highlighted a minor dip in quarterly profits, spinning it as evidence that Ellie's policies were unsustainable. Industry analysts weighed in, with one stating, "Carter's vision sounds good on paper, but in reality, fast food chains operate on thin margins. If these policies continue unchecked, Royal Burger may not remain competitive." Within hours, the article gained traction. Stock prices dipped by 3%. Major investors began calling for an emergency review of the company's long-term strategy. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, watching the headlines spread. Now it was Ellie's move. At Royal Burger headquarters, Ellie Carter read the article in silence. The room was tense. Her senior team was gathered around, some looking concerned, others frustrated. Mark Reynolds was the first to speak. "We knew he'd pull something like this, but the timing is dangerous. The board just backed you, and now he's planting doubt." Ellie closed the article and set her tablet aside. "Good. That means he's desperate." A young communications executive, Rachel Nguyen, cleared her throat. "This isn't just about perception. It's about trust. Investors are panicking, and franchisees are getting nervous. If we don't respond fast, we could lose momentum." Ellie nodded. "Then let's give them the truth." Less than 24 hours later, Ellie called for a press conference. Every major business outlet was present. Cameras flashed, microphones were adjusted, and a low murmur filled the room as reporters prepared their questions. Ellie stood at the podium, her posture strong, her voice unwavering. "I've seen the headlines," she began. "I've read the speculation. So let's talk about facts." A large screen behind her lit up, displaying real data from the company's quarterly performance. Employee turnover has decreased by 30%. Customer satisfaction scores have increased by 18%. Operational efficiency is up by 15%. She turned back to the audience. "The idea that these policies are failing is not just misleading, it's deliberately false." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ellie continued, her tone unwavering. "Our franchisees are adapting. Our customers are responding. And our employees, the backbone of this company, are more engaged than ever before. The real risk isn't change. The real risk is going backward." A reporter raised a hand. "What do you say to those claiming this strategy is hurting profits?" Ellie didn't hesitate. "This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet," she said. "This is about people. And the companies that put their people first don't just survive, they lead." The response was immediate. Major news outlets picked up the story, reframing the narrative. Business Week published an editorial titled, "Revolution or Ruin: Why Ellie Carter's Model Might Be the Future of Fast Food." Investors began to stabilize, reassured by the hard data. Customers on social media voiced support, praising the company's commitment to fairness. Even within the boardroom, some of the doubters began to reconsider. And Jonathan Pierce? He sat in his office, watching as his carefully constructed attack collapsed in real time. His jaw tightened. He had lost. That evening, Ellie stood outside her office, looking at the Chicago skyline. Mark Reynolds joined her, hands in his pockets. "You did it," he said simply. Ellie exhaled. "For now." She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Jonathan's finished, but there will always be another fight." She paused. "And we'll be ready." Across the country, Burger Royale locations were beginning to feel the effects of Ellie Carter's policies. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was undeniable. At the Ashland Avenue store, Naomi Brooks adjusted her name tag. This time, it read assistant manager. She still wasn't used to the title, but every time she caught her reflection in the employee break room mirror, she reminded herself this was real. "Hey, Naomi," Kevin Martinez called from the register. "We need more cups out front." "I got it," she said, grabbing a fresh stack from the back. As she walked through the kitchen, she overheard two employees talking near the fryers. "I actually don't hate coming to work anymore," one of them said. "It's like they actually give a damn about us now." Naomi didn't interrupt, but she felt something settle in her chest. It was pride. This was the workplace she had dreamed of, and now she was helping build it. Meanwhile, corporate reports told the same story. Customer retention was increasing. Online reviews had shifted from complaints to praise. Franchise owners who had resisted at first were now admitting that the changes had actually stabilized operations. At headquarters, Mark Reynolds stood beside Ellie in the boardroom, scanning the latest numbers. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "I think we actually pulled it off." Ellie smirked. "Did you ever doubt it?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Honestly, yes." Ellie chuckled, but she knew the truth. The fight wasn't over, because tonight she had one last meeting to attend. The business gala was held at one of Chicago's most exclusive venues, a lavish ballroom filled with industry giants, financial moguls, and corporate strategists. Ellie wasn't here to celebrate. She was here because she knew Jonathan Pierce would be. She spotted him near the bar, speaking to a group of executives. His posture was relaxed, but there was an unmistakable tension in his shoulders. He saw her, too. After excusing himself, he made his way over, a drink in hand. "Ellie." "Jonathan," she said evenly. He exhaled sharply. "I suppose congratulations are in order." Ellie tilted her head slightly. "I suppose they are." Jonathan chuckled, but it lacked humor. He swirled the liquid in his glass. "I'll admit, I underestimated you." Ellie didn't respond. She just waited. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temple. "You know, this isn't personal. It's just business." She raised an eyebrow. "That's always been the problem, hasn't it? You see people as numbers. I see them as people." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We'll see how long your idealism lasts." Ellie met his gaze steadily. "I'm not worried about how long it lasts. I'm worried about how far it goes." For the first time, Jonathan had nothing to say. He downed the rest of his drink and set the glass on the bar. "Enjoy your victory, Ellie." Then he turned and walked away. And just like that, it was over. Ellie stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The city stretched out before her, alive and full of possibilities. She had done what they said was impossible. She had changed an industry. Jonathan Pierce had always been a man of influence. For years, his name carried weight in boardrooms, investment meetings, and high-stakes corporate negotiations. But now he was a cautionary tale. His attempted coup against Ellie Carter had failed spectacularly. His alliance with Westgate Capital had crumbled the moment their smear campaign backfired. The investors who once stood by him began to distance themselves. After all, no one wanted to be associated with a man who lost. Sitting alone in his corner booth at a private club, Jonathan scrolled through his phone. No new messages, no meeting requests, no invitations to exclusive gatherings. He clenched his jaw. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years ensuring his own power, but the moment he lost it, he realized he had no real allies. Across town, Ellie Carter was leading an empire. 1 year had passed since Ellie had implemented her reforms. The latest Burger Royal annual report sat on her desk, fresh from the printer. Mark Reynolds stood beside her, flipping through the pages. Revenue is up 11% year over year, he said, tapping a highlighted section. And turnover rates? Down nearly 40%. Ellie skimmed through the numbers, nodding slightly. It wasn't just about financial growth. It was about validation. Customers were choosing Burger Royale not just because of the menu, but because they believed in what the company stood for. Employees were staying longer, working harder, and actually enjoying their jobs. The skeptics had said her approach would crash and burn. But here it was, proof that doing the right thing worked. Looks like we're on to something, Mark mused. Ellie smiled. No, Mark, we've built something. Later that afternoon, Ellie stepped into the familiar Burger Royale on Ashland Avenue. The place had changed, not physically, but in spirit. There was an ease in the way the employees moved, a lightness in their interactions. The tense, overworked atmosphere that once hung over the restaurant was gone. And at the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks. She wore a manager's badge now, her uniform crisp, her presence commanding. When she turned and saw Ellie, her eyes widened before a wide grin spread across her face. Ellie, she breathed, setting down a tray. I didn't know you were coming. Ellie smirked. Thought I'd check in on my favorite success story. Naomi let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. I still can't believe it sometimes. Ellie gestured around. Believe it. You earned this. Naomi's smile softened. I never thought I'd be here. A year ago, I was barely getting by, thinking about quitting every other week. And now, I love my job. She met Ellie's gaze. You didn't just change a company, you changed lives. Ellie felt a warmth in her chest. This was why she fought. As Ellie left the restaurant, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city. The world had doubted her. Her enemies had tried to tear her down, but she had stood her ground, and now she was leading a movement. As she stepped onto the bustling street, her phone buzzed. It was an invitation. A major hospitality group wanted her insight on implementing ethical labor reforms in their own franchises. Ellie smiled to herself. This wasn't just about Burger Royale anymore. This was just the beginning. Ellie Carter sat in the executive boardroom, the same place where she had once fought for her position, defended her vision, and reshaped an industry. But today there was no battle to be won, only a decision to be made. Across the table, members of the Royal Burger Corporation Board of Directors watched her with anticipation. Daniel Whitmore, the chairman, leaned forward. Ellie, we've all seen what you've done in the past year. You didn't just turn this company around. You changed the way the entire industry thinks about labor, wages, and ethics. He exchanged glances with the other board members before continuing. We want you to lead us into the future, not just for Royal Burger, but as a driving force in shaping the fast food industry as a whole. Ellie exhaled slowly, fingers laced together. She had anticipated this, but hearing it out loud carried a different weight. She had spent years fighting to implement real change, and now they were asking her to take an even bigger step. But a thought lingered in the back of her mind. Had she done enough? Did she need to keep pushing forward herself? Or was it time to pass the torch to the next generation? Later that evening, Ellie found herself sitting across from Mark Reynolds, the man who had been by her side through every battle. They sat in the quiet of her office, city lights flickering beyond the window. Mark studied her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Ellie broke the silence. They want me to stay, to take this further, she said, her voice measured. Mark leaned back, arms crossed. And what do you want? Ellie sighed. I don't know. I never planned for this to be forever. I wanted to fix what was broken, make sure people like Naomi Brooks never had to suffer under people like Jonathan Pierce again. She paused. But maybe I've done my part. Mark shook his head. Ellie, look around you. You didn't just fix one company. You set a precedent. He gestured toward her desk, where a folder lay open, a proposal from a major international restaurant chain asking for her guidance in reshaping their business model. You're not just a CEO anymore, Mark continued. You've become a movement. If you step away now, you leave behind a legacy no one can match. Ellie remained silent, staring at the folder. She had spent her entire career fighting for something greater, and now for the first time she realized this wasn't the end of her fight. It was just the beginning. The next morning, Ellie walked into the boardroom once more. This time with clarity, she met Daniel Whitmore's gaze and spoke firmly. I'll stay, but under one condition. A ripple of curiosity passed through the room. Ellie continued, her tone unwavering. We're not just changing Royal Burger anymore. We're changing everything. A pause. I'm launching a non-profit foundation to advocate for workers' rights in the food service industry. We'll work with lawmakers, businesses, and community leaders to ensure that fair wages and ethical labor practices become the standard, not the exception. The board members exchanged glances. Some looked hesitant, others intrigued. Daniel nodded slowly. You're thinking beyond the company. Ellie smiled. I'm thinking about the future. The announcement made headlines within days. Ellie Carter expands vision from CEO to industry reformer. The world was watching. Competitors were taking notice, and workers everywhere, from fast food employees to hospitality staff, had hope for something better. That evening, as Ellie stepped out of her office, she took a deep breath of the crisp Chicago air. The path ahead wasn't easy, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't walking against the tide. She was leading it, and she was ready. At the heart of this story is a simple truth. Real change starts with those who dare to challenge the system. Ellie Carter didn't just fight for better wages or fair treatment. She fought for something bigger, a future where businesses don't just chase profits, but value the people who make them thrive. And in the end, she proved that doing the right thing isn't just good ethics, it's good business. So now, the question is, what would you do if you had the power to change something? Would you walk away, or would you stand and fight like Ellie did? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you love stories of power, redemption, and the fight for justice, make sure to subscribe, because we have plenty more coming your way.